state of war exists between us. The fateful words uttered on that September morning in 1939 rang up the curtain on a worldwide holocaust. These pictures set the scene of the story which can now be told. The story of the achievements of the Southern Railway workshops and the men and women who toiled in them during those weary years of conflict. These were the early days of the Britain can take it period, when the gallant first of the few heroically tackled a numerically superior Luftwaffe and boffins in their schools for secrets strove to devise a weapon for its defeat. Britain could take it, but taking all that Jerry liked to give was not in keeping with the Southern's traditions. Our works people quickly shed their fatalism and began to do things. Some of their early operations were performed on passenger coaches which were completely stripped and refitted for the Red Cross service. Other companies' coaches, as well as our own, were converted in the East Lee shops for hospital work. The first 4 were actually ready only 12 days after the outbreak of war. A few months later, they were in constant use. The undertones of war in Europe were soon amplified to full blast for the whole world to hear. During those desperate days, with the threat of invasion so imminent, any weapon which could be used effectively was brought out from its own particular limbo and pressed into service. Although the work was utterly strange to them, the men on the benches in the Southern Railway shops took the switch over from the maintenance of locos to the reconditioning of old howitzers in their stride. Later, the highly skilled business of making barrels for a famous anti-tank gun, the 2-pounder, was effected in our shops to government specification. All the processes involved in the manufacture of these barrels were carried out by the Southern's workers. The forgings were bored and cut and drilled and planed and milled and finally finished with all that expert craftsmanship which is still a joy of those who believe that to buy British is to buy the best. And this right in the middle of the biggest crisis which we as a nation have ever faced. The men and women of the Southern really were delivering the goods. Goods needed urgently for the war fronts as well as for the home front. Nuisance raids seemed to affect production but little. Work went on energetically as the Southern Railway helped Britain to build up that striking force so necessary for her salvation. Another peep behind the scenes at the East Lee shops, where they made the very hush-hush 2-inch rocket guns, which were mounted on our merchant ships to repel unwelcome attentions from enemy dive bombers. A heavily armored pillar box was the main feature of the guns. In this sat the operator who, from behind his metal screen, fired off the rockets, several at a time. Racks fixed to the side of the pillar boxes held the rockets. All the tests and sighting necessary to ensure that these rocket guns were an effective weapon were carried out in our own shops during the course of manufacture. Once all the sights and racks had been lined up, the guns were given routine checks before being handed over to the government. Few people saw these rocket guns in action, but it can easily be imagined that all out they made things very unpleasant for visitors from the Luftwaffe. During the daylight nuisance raid period, the workshop sirens voiced only warnings of real and immediate danger. And from among the Southern's men who were working with such exemplary application at their war tasks came the Southern Railway Home Guard, trained by professional instructors to a high degree of military proficiency. They performed most of the duties done by Army personnel, including the manning of their own shop's anti-aircraft guns, the renowned Bofors. And there was nothing wrong with their gun drill. Incidentally, these pictures are of the Lancing Works team. At this time, ack-ack was of prime importance as a strong deterrent to enemy raiders. Later on, it was found to be a valuable antidote to the serious menace of the flying bomb. By this time, the Red Star of the Soviet people had firmly fixed itself in the minds of the British as an emblem of immeasurable courage and tenacity. Aid to Russia. Banners, headlines, public speakers and government announcements, all of them proclaimed the pressing need for assistance to our great ally. Russia needed supplies. She needed them urgently. Her one lifeline, still uncut by the Nazi, was that long, arduous, but incredibly romantic one stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Caucasus. Again, in response to the government's call, the Southern's workers at the Ashford shops set to with a will to make 1,000 goods wagons for the Soviet railways. This was aid to Russia indeed. All the wagon parts were standardized and numbered to correspond with the numbers marked on photographs already in Russian hands, so that on arrival at their destination, they could be assembled without difficulty. Our machines bit off and spewed out lengths of angle iron, correct in measurement to the nearest decimal point. More machines sawed and planed and drilled, expertly guided by the Southern's workpeople. Never did work go on with a more singing rhythm. It was now that the slogan, "Britain can make it," was born and proved beyond all possible doubt. Everyone, man, woman and boy, put in as many as 67 hours a week in the great rush to make the 1,792 parts required for every one of the 1,000 wagons ordered for the Soviet. Meanwhile, British troops had already taken that long voyage out east, via the Cape and Aden, to the Persian Gulf, to Basra, to Persia and Iraq. The supply route to the Caucasus was lined with them. Britain was taking no chances of munitions going astray. And the supplies came unfailingly. If ever pride of achievement can be justified, this feat of the Southern's work people was justification enough. There they are, a trainload of wagons made at the rate of 20 a day, off to Russia. First stop, Basra. A favorite command of our forces NCO was, "Get mobile," an order taken literally by the Ashford shops when they created a number of mobile workshops for services use. These were fitted with everything necessary to make them most useful additions to Army equipment. Another effective transport weapon made in the Southern's Ashford shops, the tank ramp wagon. One of these ramp wagons placed in front of a whole trainload of tanks enabled them to detrain without the use of lifting gear. The tanks just drove off under their own power. As you see, the ramp wagon lowered part of its floor to form an incline down which the tanks passed one after the other. This saved an enormous amount of time and labor. Careful driving by the tank crews was the real reason for its success. Here's another transport problem which the Southern solved for the government. In the case of this bridge-carrying tank, we made the bridge and fitted it at Eastleigh Works. See how easily it unfolds over that hole in the ground, bridging what might be an awkward gap. Now, over the bridge she goes and on to victory. Simple, isn't it? Now we come to one of the peak moments of the lease-lend period. Railway transport difficulties in England were growing enormous, and to help alleviate the strain on our local shops, the Yanks sent over a number of their own locomotives which had to be prepared for the track on arrival here. This work couldn't be considered strange to our Eastleigh people. A locomotive is a locomotive the world over, they said. But the American tendency to put so many of the works on the outside of the boiler casing was a bit puzzling, even though it looked very impressive that way. However, these engines were successfully got ready for their European war service, and no vital parts were left over. They were intended primarily to restock the French railways after our inevitable invasion. It was already known that the Germans had requisitioned the greater number of French locos for their own use. Damage to what remained was likely to occur as the result of our own pre-invasion bombing. So until D-Day, these American locos served their apprenticeship somewhere in England. Later on, they did a grand job supporting our armies along their long and difficult road to victory. The tide of the war turned, and instead of working under the threat of Nazi invasion, our workspeople toiled with the hope of our invasion as their spur. And then came one of their most hectic periods. Here are some of them constructing boats, fast motorboats at the Eastleigh shops for coming excitements. Girls and men worked side by side, sharing the same work. All of them deserve this brief pictorial tribute to their skill and industry. To carry our invasion troops onto the French beaches, the southern shops made any number of these flat-bottomed LCPs, landing craft personnel. This construction work was completely new to the workshops people, and although it is more than likely that many of them had often pushed the boat out before, few, if any, attempted to build one. On completion, the LCPs were moved to Southampton, where they took to the water like the proverbial duck. The safety of our troops was the responsibility of the builders of these landing craft, and as it proved, in them no one got the wrong sort of let down in the channel. Another type of invasion craft constructed in the southern shops, harbour launches, used for general purposes and capable of carrying 50 men or stores. These launches were constructed over wooden jigs, which as soon as work was sufficiently forward, were removed to give the workers access to the insides. The first skin was put on in strips, all laid in one direction. The strips were clamped and riveted in place. A second skin was then overlaid, the strips running in the opposite direction so that the strain would be equal and that the body would retain its shape when the jig was removed. This view gives some idea of the finished article. The launch was now ready for fitting and finishing and for all those other processes which make a vessel seaworthy. They brought on the girls to do what was known as driving and clenching boat nails, and at the end of their act, the boys came back to install the engines and perform intricate and delicate feats of wiring and all the other things which made these craft so dependable. Incidentally, these harbour launches were so large it was quite impossible to get them out of the shops in the normal way, and so traversers, usually employed to remove railway coaches from the carriage works to the running track, were called in to handle this special job, in which they proved most effective. Here was something to get steamed up about: keels for assault landing craft. The wood had to be bent into the required shape to form the keels of the vessels, and to effect this easily, it was first steamed and softened. When the wood had become sufficiently amenable to discipline, it was removed from the steamer and laid on the keel blocks, where, with the aid of artfully placed wedges and gentle taps from that most useful tool, the persuader, it began to take shape. The first stage of the construction work was done. Frames of a peculiar shape were fitted to the keel and knocked into position. A few more of these and the craft assumed an odd Noah's Ark appearance, which rather appealed to one's sense of humour. Then came the first layer of the sides, the inner skin. This was of wood cut in sections and measured accurately to fractions of an inch. The wood was afterwards covered by the real thing, the armour plating, which converted Noah's Ark into a war vessel, capable of withstanding any sort of flood. Then the fitting began, a charmingly vague term. By this time, the shop's workpeople had become experienced boat builders, and it is not surprising that among all the craft which they had constructed for the invasion, none was reported to have been a dud. It is only right to give those workers this verbal pat on the back, which they so well deserve. There goes an assault landing craft, just one of the many things made in the southern workshops which cannot by any means be allied to normal railway work. Hats off to you, Eastleigh. second front was now the subject of practically every conversation one overheard. In the Southern's workshops, they didn't just talk about it. There, great preparations for the Allied invasion of Europe were taking place. Here are some of the MLCs, motor lighter craft, in the course of construction. These craft were intended primarily for carrying tanks. Heavy armor plate was a notable feature of these vessels, particularly on the steersman's shelter, the nerve center in which was located the steering gear, radio, and other important gadgets. Day by day, the building of the MLCs progressed noticeably. These craft were very satisfactory things to work on, as they so forcefully suggested the aggressive power quite in keeping with their intended function. One of their more interesting features was the formidable-looking front door, if such a term can be used in connection with such a war machine, a door which could be let down rather like a drawbridge to enable the tanks carried inside the vessel to run out under their own power when the invasion beach was reached. The very size of these MLCs made their removal from their birthplace a matter of careful calculation and even more careful execution. As a point of interest, the doors of this particular shop where the vessel was made had to be specially enlarged to afford a comfortable exit. Meticulous road transport organization was necessary for the conveyance of the motor lighter craft from the shops at Eastleigh to Southampton docks. As these craft were an out-of-gauge load, this journey could not be covered by rail. En route to Southampton, special traffic police cleared the way before them. All other traffic was parked on the roadside to give the MLCs a free and unhindered passage. On arrival at the dock gates, the Southern Railway's Southampton staff took over the job of transferring the craft from the lorries across the quays to the river. Sheer legs assisted in the launching, the first real test of the workshop people's skill at boat building. Back at Eastleigh, a last look round the boat building section revealed one more important craft which should be mentioned, the LCSM, short for Landing Craft Support Medium. These big boats were designed to cover our invasion troops as they landed from their LCPs, and for this purpose they were made additionally strong. The steel plating which covered them was a great help in that connection. The high elevation of their guns enabled them to engage enemy planes as well as ground targets. There goes a helpful contribution to the invasion fleet, with best wishes from the Eastleigh shops. So far, you've seen only operations carried out by the Southern Railway's employees for the land and seaborne forces. Now, what about the air forces? Well, one of the tasks most successfully accomplished was the manufacture of tail units for aerial torpedoes. These tail units, made up of a multiplicity of little bits of wood, each of the utmost importance to the whole construction, were the things which kept aerial torpedoes on a level keel and straight on their course once they had been launched by their carrier planes. When fitted with one of these tail pieces, the torpedo, instead of nosediving into the sea as would normally be the case, reached the surface of the water in a horizontal position and proceeded towards its target without deflection from the original aim. The advantage lay in the fact that a torpedo thus fitted could be launched accurately from a much greater height than would be the case where the necessity to engage the enemy ship at close range would possibly mean the loss of our plane. The manufacture of these tail pieces involved an enormous number of processes. The cutting of myriad bits of wood, planing, gluing, covering, painting, all with the highest degree of accuracy to ensure the proper balance and performance of the finished article. In all these delicate operations, the skillful, sensitive fingers of a host of women workers proved an enormous asset. They all toiled long hours at their individual jobs with a tireless good cheer that was quite a tonic in its effect. It is impossible, in this short record of the war jobs done in the southern railway shops, to outline every process through which these aerial torpedo tail units had to pass before they reached the testing stage. The striking fact is that the work was done by our employees in an entirely satisfactory manner. These tail units were difficult things to make, and in addition to the woodwork of the body, there was the business of fitting cylinders and gyroscopes and goodness knows what else to enable them to fulfill their purpose. Although these pictures reveal that the girls did most of the work on the aerial torpedo tail pieces, it was left to the inspector to examine them and to make a final checkup. There is no record of any complaint from him regarding faulty workmanship. Break for workers' playtime. Here's Fanny, special envoy from Ensa, putting over a hot one while she absent-mindedly tears that newspaper into daily doilies for the canteen trays. One advantage of schizophrenia anyway. The audience warms up to appreciative temperature, and thus encouraged, Mabel makes short work of any doubt about her ability to knock up a tune on the what's it. Lunchtime over, and back to the grim work of preparing for the invasion once more. In this shop, they made pontoons. Actually, these were the center sections of pontoon bridges across which were to be laid roads to facilitate the passage of our troops with their tanks and heavy vehicles. Naturally, the Jerrys would destroy as many bridges and create as many barriers as possible to stem the advance of our armies during the invasion period. And these pontoons would then be of major importance in maintaining road communications. Enormous strides in the manufacture and use of laminated plywood during the war made short work of a number of constructional problems. Strength with lightness and resilience was a feature of this new medium, and it was employed with the greatest effect. New workshops creations were born almost hourly, and all the time the one thought, invasion, was the incentive to the greatest effort. When all the bolting, gluing and painting was done, each finished pontoon had to be tested. As it was intended to uphold the weight of heavy tanks, it was necessary to ensure that it could do this. So it was immersed in a special testing tank capable of exerting a total pressure of 6 tons on the submerged pontoon. And if it got through that severe medical, it was passed OK for the Army. This was an unusual job, the weighing of small test pieces from each lot of timber in stock to check their moisture content before the wood could be passed as fit in the manufacture of tail units for the famous Horsa gliders. Once okayed, each little piece of wood was stamped and numbered to assist the people on the workshop benches in their intricate job of fitting them into the jigsaw, the successful completion of which was of the greatest importance to our chances of success in the coming invasion. Gradually, the components were built up into recognizable shapes, which were stacked ready to meet the continual demands from the assembly line. Plywood, limp as linoleum and strong as you like, and incidentally very costly, was used in skinning the frames of the gliders. This job had to be done with meticulous care and secrecy, and the Eastleigh shop's workers, by this time quite used to secrets, knew how to keep mum. This is how the carriage shops looked when the building of the glider tail units was the top priority job. It's rather difficult to reconcile these scenes of tranquil efficiency with the rattle and roar of total war, the ultimate destiny of every one of the tail units made here. The meticulous care taken in the manufacture of the tail units has already been mentioned. And here is one of these interesting gadgets which was used to detect and register the presence of any moisture in the joints of the frames before they were skinned. Once the work of skinning the tailplanes was begun, the frames looked more like something to do with aircraft. Rather a far cry from those sleek, comfortable coaches in which we used to travel, and which would normally occupy the floor space in this shop during their building period. When putting in the spars of the tailplanes, the girls thought out a Stakhanovite method of attacking the job. As you see, they stood on opposite sides of the frame, and as one hammered, the other blocked the knocks, so to speak. Then they swapped tools so that the alternate nailing could progress rapidly. In the days when we knew something about aircraft recognition, we might have recognized this as a rudder in course of manufacture. These rudders were fabricated in exactly the same way. The framework was overlaid with a special ply and was afterwards covered with fabric. You can see this rudder shaping already. The extremely pliable skin was tailored to fit exactly. Notice how those points on the scallops meet the ribs in just the right place. The leather tapes held everything together while minute adjustments were made and all the screwing and gluing was completed. These spars were included in the structure to give it extra strength. So far, so good. These completed skeletons can now wait for the next process while we take a look at the fins. The extremely opportune invention of the plywood used in these skinning processes on the tail unit components proved an absolute boon to the Southern Railway Workshops people. They handled so much of it during this period. It was extremely versatile in use, easy to deal with, and of great strength, just the thing for the job in hand. Now this was the really satisfying stage of the construction of the tail units. Fin, rudder and tailplane were given a trial assembly. They called it a mock-up. The assembly was thoroughly examined and any faults of construction and performance were adjusted before each individual part was finally covered with protective fabric. When everyone concerned was quite satisfied that everything was as it should be, the mock-up was dismantled again and each component of the tail unit was taken back to its shop for the spraying treatment. Housewives who spent their coupons on surplus government fabrics did well. Here is some of it undergoing a strict examination before use on the gliders. When this fabric was okayed, the glider components were covered with it. This stitchcraft might be a little different from petit point or crewel work, but these girls certainly did sew a fine seam. A protective covering of dope was applied to the fabric to help the finished glider to withstand the effects of weather. After this, the seams were taped. The girls on this job soon developed an interesting technique known among themselves as passing the buck. The tapes, once applied and fixed in position over the seams, were then covered with another coat of protective dope, and when dry, the tailplane was ready for the finishing touches. The construction of these Horsa glider tail units in the Southern's workshops was one of those top secret jobs which the everyday man and woman on the benches took as a matter of course. Most of them must have been fully aware of what was happening, but their still tongues indicated their wise heads. The general secrecy which surrounded their work was maintained to the last. Few people before have had this peep behind the scenes in the Southern Railway Workshops, at those people who did so much to help maintain the lines behind the lines during those 6 long and weary years of war. Their reward came with the invasion, that crowning onslaught to which their efforts had contributed enormously. This film, which has concentrated on their grim and colourless tasks, now makes a long overdue acknowledgement.